I'm talking now, if you don't mind, please. Does that sound familiar?
I have to say, all this talk about the mute button and how the candidates were going to be muted when it wasn't their turn to talk and they were going to use them. Like, where was the mute button?
President Trump, we have to move on. President Trump.
Let's turn to policy, please.
Trump was just driving straight through that mute button.
The lax rules on the mute button seemed to work against Trump in a way that his campaign very much believed that it would.
Well, he seemed to be enjoying it.
It's the very fine line between what Trump and his mouth want and what his campaign advisors advise him to do.
A very tricky line indeed. Welcome to the campaign moment on this very early morning on Wednesday, September 11th. I'm Martine Powers, co-host of Post Reports.
And I'm Aaron Blake, senior political reporter and author of the Campaign Moment newsletter. All right, so we just finished the first debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. It was Tuesday night in Philadelphia. And we're going to be going over a lot of the biggest moments from this debate and also talking a little bit about what they could mean for the campaign ahead.
And Aaron, before we dive into all that, I do want to take a moment to just set the stakes here and why this debate was so momentous. This is likely going to be the only debate that we'll see between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. It was actually the first time that these two candidates had ever met in person, which made for a very interesting moment at the beginning when they first came out on the stage. And Harris basically went over to Trump and stuck out her hand and introduced herself.
Kamala Harris. Let's have a good debate.
Nice to see you. Have fun.
Thank you.
It was just like, wow, you're right. These people have never met each other before. And of course, this was a debate that really focused on Harris and her efforts to define herself to the American people because she is lesser known of the two candidates. So, Aaron, my first question is, did Harris achieve that, defining herself to the American people?
I think in certain ways she did. As far as like introducing Harris to voters who are just learning about her, she went through her policies towards the top of the debate. She brought it back at the end. But the middle part of the debate was overwhelmingly focused on Trump in a way that I think the Harris campaign really likes and the Trump campaign probably doesn't like because it was just so focused on Trump's own vulnerabilities and she really seemed to kind of have the upper hand on that.
Yeah, one of the things that we talked about recently in anticipating this debate and how Harris was going to perform was this going to be an opportunity for prosecutor Harris to come out, for her to put those tough questions to Trump? And I think not only did it come out, but I think that, at least it felt to me, that those were often the strongest moments for her in this debate.
Donald Trump was fired by 81 million people. So let's be clear about that. And clearly he is having a very difficult time processing that. But we cannot afford to have a president of the United States who attempts, as he did in the past, to upend the will of the voters in a free and fair election.
What we saw in her performance was she hit just about everything that her campaign probably would have wanted her to, Project 2025.
What you're going to hear tonight is a detailed and dangerous plan called Project 2025 that the former president intends on implementing if he were elected again.
January 6th.
I was at the Capitol on January 6th.
Trump's comments about dictators.
He admires dictators, wants to be a dictator on day one, according to himself.
She kind of ticked all the boxes of things that her campaign would have want to reintroduce voters to. And that's significant because Donald Trump has become more popular since he's left office. The memories of January 6th have faded to some degree. The memories of his presidency have faded, and he's perhaps looked better relative to the last 3.5 years of the Biden administration. And she was kind of versed and prepared in a way that people around Donald Trump wished he were for this debate.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about his performance because, as we talked about before, one of the big questions going into this debate for him was this question of self-control. Could he deliver a disciplined, focused message? And could he resist the temptation to lash out or to let Harris get under his skin? Do you think that he was successful at that?
Well, for the most part, he wasn't, attacking her personally as dumb and things like that, or her race. Trump had some off-color comments about her race a while back, and that only came up when it was brought up by the debate moderators. And he went into some
he
detail.
did double down on them when it was brought up.
He did double down on it.
Let's listen to that tape.
Mr. President, you recently said of Vice President Harris, quote, "I didn't know she was black until a number of years ago when she happened to turn black, and now she wants to be known as black." I want to ask a bigger picture question here tonight. Why do you believe it's appropriate to weigh in on the racial identity of your opponent?
I don't, and I don't care. I don't care what she is. I don't care. You make a big deal out of something, I couldn't care less. Whatever she wants to be is okay with me.
But those were your words, so I'm
I
asking.
don't know. I mean, all I can say is I read where she was not black, that she put out, and I'll say that. And then I read that she was black.
He was also so defensive the entire time. He was talking about his own liabilities, the things that Americans didn't find appealing in him. And often he would kind of try and get the time back to keep talking about these things. The moderators would try to move on, and he would just keep going after it in a really defensive posture.
And moments when you could see almost a trap being laid by Harris or her saying something that you could feel was intended to kind of poke the bear, and then him essentially taking the bait. I think one example of that came early on when Harris was asked about immigration, and she brings up this bill that President Biden tried to pass earlier this year on border security and how Trump pushed to kill that bill. Then Harris goes out of her way to talk about Trump's rallies, that his rallies are poorly attended, that people find his comments and statements so meandering and nonsensical that they are leaving early from his rallies. And of course, we know that that's something that Trump cares deeply about.
I'm going to actually do something really unusual, and I'm going to invite you to attend one of Donald Trump's rallies, because it's a really interesting thing to watch. You will see during the course of his rallies, he talks about fictional characters like Hannibal Lecter. He will talk about windmills cause cancer. And what you will also notice is that people start leaving his rallies early out of exhaustion and boredom. And I will tell you, the one thing you will not hear him talk about is you. You will not hear him talk about your needs, your dreams, and your desires. And I'll tell you, I believe you deserve a president who actually puts you first, and I pledge to you that I will.
Vice President Harris, thank you. President Trump, on that point, I want to get your response.
Well, I would like to respond.
Let me just ask, though, why did you try to kill that bill, and successfully so? That would have put thousands of additional agents and officers on the border.
First, let me respond as to the
Please.
rallies. She said people start leaving. People don't go to her rallies. There's no reason to go. And the people that do go, she's bussing them in and paying them to be there, and then showing them in a different light. So she can't talk about that. People don't leave my rallies. We have the biggest rallies, the most incredible rallies in the history of politics.
You know, every minute in this debate is so valuable, and for him to take that opportunity to just say, no, people are showing up, I promise. It's just likely not what his campaign would have wanted to see.
Yeah, and they had to know that this was coming. The Harris campaign on Tuesday morning debuted an ad that featured Barack Obama, at the Democratic National Convention a few weeks back, talking about this issue and making a suggestive gesture about Donald Trump and about his crowd sizes. So, they knew this was going to come, and Trump couldn't let it go.
It wasn't just Harris baiting him, right? There were some strange tangents that Trump went down that were relatively unprompted. And I think the one that really sticks out in my head is this moment where Trump is talking about rumors of dogs being eaten in Springfield, Ohio. And before we listen to the tape, I think it's so frankly nonsensical that you need the context to understand. But there are rumors that have been going around in right-wing social media circles that in Springfield, Ohio, immigrants, and specifically immigrants from Haiti, have been stealing people's dogs and eating them. And it's also something that has zero evidence behind it. But let's hear how it played out at the debate.
In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets of the people that live there. And this is what's happening in our country, and it's a shame. As far as rallies are concerned, as far as the reason they go is they like what I say. They want to bring our country back.
I mean, that right there is kind of a case in point. We talked about him being preoccupied with crowd sizes. He made a point to come back to that in that answer. And then just the Springfield, Ohio thing is just such a bizarre thing. It has been seized upon by Trump's allies. J.D. Vance tweeted about it as if it were legitimate reports this week. And then actually on Tuesday afternoon, even before the debate, Vance conceded that, maybe these rumors actually weren't true. And then we have Trump come out here and state this as a fact. It just kind of got into how much of this debate was full of misinformation and how Trump really didn't seem to have a firm ground to stand on when it came to actually arguing about real policies.
And I will say this was one of the moments where one of the moderators did step in to make clear and to fact check Trump in the moment and say, this is not true.
I just want to clarify here. You bring up Springfield, Ohio, and ABC News did reach out to the city manager there. He told us there had been no credible reports of specific claims of pets being harmed, injured, or abused by individuals.
That was also an interesting feature of this debate because the last debate with Biden and Trump, CNN's moderators decided that they were not going to be fact-checking. And at several junctures in this debate, we saw them insert themselves into this and say, Trump says, violent migrant crime is on the rise, or violent crime is rising. That's not actually the case. The claim about Springfield, Illinois is not actually the case. Democrats wanting to execute babies after birth is not something that's legal in any state. These are legitimate fact checks, but it's not something that we saw in the last debate. And that really, I think, worked against Trump.
I think that we could spend a lot of time in this conversation just going through point by point some of the falsehoods that Trump did bring up and things that needed to be fact-checked in the moment. Of course, his comments about the rise in crime, which is not true. And we had a whole post-reports episode about that this week, the fact that violent crime in this country is actually down from 2020 nationally, and it's not up. But one piece of fact-checking that I do want to come back to that you just mentioned is this claim about the execution of babies. And just for context here, so people understand, this is when Trump was being asked by the moderators about his stance on abortion. And the idea was brought up that Trump had flip-flopped on abortion several times in different ways over the years. And in the context of him answering one of these questions about abortion, he brings up this claim that he has said before. He said it in the debate between him and President Biden earlier this summer, which is that babies are being executed in liberal states, which is not true at all. He says that this is happening in Virginia. Let's hear one of the moments where that came up.
But the governor before, he said the baby will be born and we will decide what to do with the baby. In other words, we'll execute the baby. And that's why I did that, because that predominates, because they're radical. The Democrats are radical in that. And her vice presidential pick, which I think was a horrible pick, by the way, for our country, because he is really out of it. But her vice presidential pick says abortion in the 9th month is absolutely fine.
Considering how critical an issue abortion is in this election and how much a lot of the results in November will hang on women voters, how they feel about Trump. Aaron, I'm curious what you made of this moment and whether or not this is going to be a real factor in women who might have considered voting for Trump being this is not who makes sense for me and my rights or is thinking about abortion, or what do you make of it?
Yeah, I thought that Harris spoke to these issues in ways that Biden simply couldn't and hasn't been able to over the course of his political career. She got real kind of seemingly emotional about these things. She talked about the Trump abortion bans and what red states are doing by, banning abortion, in some cases not allowing exceptions for rape and incest. She talked about, what happens when 12 and 13-year-old girls are raped and have, confronting these situations.
And to your point, when Harris talked about this, not only did she talk about this in terms of rights and women's agency over their own bodies, but also in terms of healthcare. And then there was also the example of her talking about women who are pregnant, who want to have children, who are excited and enthusiastic about their pregnancies, and for health reasons, they have a miscarriage. They need emergency care that they cannot get. And let's listen to a little bit of Harris talking about that.
The government, and Donald Trump certainly, should not be telling a woman what to do with her body. I have talked with women around our country. You want to talk about this is what people wanted? Pregnant women who want to carry a pregnancy to term, suffering from a miscarriage, being denied care in an emergency room because the healthcare providers are afraid they might go to jail, and she's bleeding out in a car in the parking lot. She didn't want that. Her husband didn't want that.
The amount of time that was spent on this issue and Harris's ability to prosecute the case, I think, is really significant, because this is an issue that has cut so strongly against the Republican Party pretty much ever since Roe v. Wade was overturned in 2022. We're actually seeing that states where they are holding ballot initiatives to enshrine abortion rights into their state constitution, these are polling better than they have in any other previous states that have held such measures. Like, I think that gets at how this is such a problematic issue for Republicans. And basically all Trump has offered on this is pointing to those things we talked about. And then other than that, saying, well, I'm just leaving it to the states, and kind of trying to leave it at that, which it just shows how troubling this issue is for the Republican Party. And it got a very significant airing on Tuesday night.
Okay, so let's take a quick break. And then coming up, we will have more on this debate. And we're going to unpack some late-breaking news from right after the end of the debate about an endorsement from a very well-known childless cat lady. We're going to dig into that. We'll be right back. So I do want to take a second to talk a little bit about what Trump arguably did somewhat well in this debate. And I think one thing that I noticed is that he, in his tangents, in some of the more bizarre interludes that he leaned into, he was also really successful at avoiding difficult questions. We talked about that moment where he was talking about the rallies earlier. That was in response to a question that was being asked to him about immigration and why he tried to kill a border security bill. There were other moments where he was asked tough questions like what he wants mass deportations to look like, what he thinks the solution is to the situation in Gaza. And he basically was able to not answer those questions at all. I don't know. I'm curious, Aaron, what your sense is of in what ways we saw some strengths from Trump tonight.
Yeah, a couple other examples of this that I was struck by was when he was asked by David Muir, the ABC News moderator, about January 6th and whether Trump would have done anything differently if he had to do it all over again. And Trump kind of talked around that, even though the question was asked again.
Is there anything you regret about what you did on that day? Yes or no?
I had nothing to do with that other than they asked me to make a speech. I showed up for a speech. I said, I think it's going to be big. I went to Nancy Pelosi and the mayor of Washington, D.C., and the mayor put it back in writing, as you know. I said, this is going to be a very big rally or whatever you want to call it. And again, it wasn't done by me. It was done by others. I said, I'd like to give you 10,000 National Guard or soldiers. They rejected me. Nancy Pelosi rejected me. It was just 2 weeks ago.
Trump was asked what his plan on health care would be. Before it was all about repeal Obamacare. As president, he repeatedly kind of pushed off putting forward his own health care plan.
So just a yes or no, you still do not have a plan?
I have concepts of a plan. I'm not president right now.
And I think I have a concept of a plan is maybe a phrase that will haunt him going forward, or I was already seeing people latch on to as a example of his vagueness.
Yeah, and also, he made a comment about being a really significant figure for fertilization when he was talking about IVF. So that's another one of those that's going to kind of be meme-ified, I'm sure.
A leader on fertilization, I think was the phrase.
I've been a leader on it. They know that, and everybody else knows it. I have been a leader on fertilization, IVF.
He did correct himself soon to say IVF, we should add. Yeah, I mean, I would say Harris also avoided directly answering some of the questions, specifically when it came to what her restrictions on abortion would be. how she differs from Biden's immigration policy. She kind of just went and talked about the Senate immigration bill, which, of course, Biden also supported. So there was plenty of this kind of avoiding the question to go around, and the format kind of allowed for that. But for Trump, I do think that it really kind of comes back to the lack of him being versed in policy and kind of being able to hit Kamala Harris on her past positions. It wasn't until very late in the debate that he started talking about fracking and her proposal in 2020 for a mandatory gun buyback program. Like, these are things that have been there for him since she got in the race, and he hasn't been able to kind of deliver a very policy-focused attack on her. He's not comfortable doing it, it seems. Instead, he talks more broadly about the size of, undocumented immigrants in the country and migrant crime and things like that. He just can't kind of get her on specifics in a way that I think was really called for in a debate where she's being introduced to voters.
One last point that Harris raised that I wanted to ask you about is Harris talking about Trump as a convicted felon. And of course, one of the things that made the case for why Harris would be a good replacement for Biden in this race was the fact that she was a prosecutor. She would be going up against someone who now has a criminal conviction, and that she would be able to talk about that in a certain experienced way that might stick or land with voters. Let's hear how Harris talked about Trump's convictions.
Well, I think this is so rich. Coming from someone who has been prosecuted for national security crimes, economic crimes, election interference, has been found liable for sexual assault, and his next big court appearance is in November at his own criminal sentencing.
Aaron, do you think that Americans who watched this debate heard that and were persuaded by that argument from Harris that, like, this guy is a criminal and that you shouldn't vote for him for that reason?
Yeah, it was interesting that she brought up some of the other things that he hasn't been convicted for yet before she mentioned the Manhattan conviction. Certainly the Manhattan conviction is considered the least serious of the criminal charges against Trump. And I haven't seen Democrats kind of, they've been a little uneasy about how much to play this up. But I do think it was a point of emphasis for them because a debate is something where casual voters and people who haven't been paying attention are tuning in. And, I've looked at polls on this. Like, there are people who are not that familiar with Trump's criminal cases. They may know that he was convicted, but they don't know necessarily what it was for or how serious it was. And she kind of mentioned that in the service of painting him as someone who does not respect the rule of law, someone who gets in all these kinds of trouble, and kind of that feeds into her argument that his presidency would just be too chaotic. Like, this is somebody who we need to turn the page on and move on from.
So thinking about what we saw in this, I guess, a little over hour and a half that we watched tonight, how do you think this debate moved the needle, if it did at all?
Yeah, I think if there's anybody who is gaining anything from this debate, it is most likely to be Kamala Harris. Whether any one individual thing is going to really reshape this entire race, I think is difficult to see that happening. Is she going to take a 5-point lead after this debate? I don't think anybody's going to be taking 5-point leads anytime soon. But this is an election that is decided on the margins. To the extent that this is influencing a couple percentage points worth of people, maybe it dissuades some Trump voters from turning out. Maybe it instills Americans with some confidence in her as a candidate. That certainly matters. It is also probably the most high-profile event by which these two will be judged. We don't know if we're going to have another debate. The Harris campaign says they want one. The Trump campaign seems to suggest that they're inclined to try and negotiate a more favorable news network to be holding this on. So this is really something that is going to form a lot of people's opinions about this race, more so than a usual year where you have 3 of these kinds of debates between the two candidates. And so if Harris is indeed adjudged to be the winner and did herself good in this debate, that's a significant data point in her favor in a race that is looking very, very close right now.
You said that you imagine that this debate might have formed a lot of people's opinions about the campaign. And I will say one huge piece of evidence that suggests that that's true is the endorsement that we saw come out right after the end of the debate. Long awaited, Taylor Swift is endorsing Kamala Harris. And in her Instagram post about this, she said, I watched the debate tonight and I decided that Harris is a person who is defending and protecting the things that are important for me. And she signed it from a childless cat lady, which I'm sure a lot of Democrats will go gaga over.
It's interesting. The first thing I thought when this came out was Harris might want this to have happened later, not on the debate night. Certainly it points towards the debate, but this was another key moment that she could have had, in the future days.
You mean that everyone's going to wake up on Wednesday morning talking about Taylor Swift and not Kamala Harris?
It's kind of like the Democratic National Convention. Is Beyonce going to show up on the final night? Well, no, Kamala Harris probably wants her speech to be the focus rather than Beyonce.
Though, Aaron, I just think it says something crazy about the state of this race right now, and I would love to get your political history take on this. When is the last time that Taylor Swift and Dick Cheney endorsed the same candidate within a 1-week period?
We are in uncharted territory in American politics, certainly. I'm glad you mentioned those alongside each other because I think they're somewhat similar.
Really? How?
Well, they're not similar people, but the impact of this could be similar. Are people sitting by their computers and waiting to see who Taylor Swift endorses? Are they sitting by their computers and waiting for Dick Cheney's endorsement in this race? Not necessarily, but Dick Cheney, as a conservative Republican, can give certain people the permission structure to get on board with Harris or sit out voting for Trump. And ditto Taylor Swift. She could potentially get some people interested in this campaign in a way that could help on the margins. And so these endorsements matter for different reasons, but they kind of could have a similar impact in that way.
I see an opportunity for Dick Cheney and Taylor Swift to get together and do some kind of co-endorsement event or something. I think that'll truly be the moment when this campaign jumps the shark.
She's got a blank space and she could write Dick Cheney's name.
Wow, a good reference.
I've got a daughter. Come
You've
on.
listened to a few songs. Okay. Aaron, it is late, and I think both you and I need to go to sleep soon. So we're going to wrap it here. But thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation.
Thank you. And make sure that you're all subscribing to the Campaign Moment newsletter, of course.
Absolutely. And you can find a link to the Campaign Moment newsletter in our show notes and at postreports.com. That's it for tonight's overnight episode of The Campaign Moment. If you're tuning in via Post Reports, The Campaign Moment will not be in your feeds until next week. If you want to hear the Friday episode that we have planned, you're going to have to listen to that exclusively over at the Campaign Moment show feed itself. So if you're not yet subscribed to the Campaign Moment, go into your podcast app right now, look for the Campaign Moment, follow it, and listen out for Friday's episode because you're not going to want to miss it.
Today's episode was produced and mixed by Ted Muldoon and Laura Benshoff. It was edited by Lucy Perkins and Mary Jo Murphy.
I'm Martine Powers.
And I'm Aaron Blake.
Aaron, see you next time.
Bye, Martine.